WNST, Towson, Baltimore, and WNST.net. Everyone knows I love a good story here, and of course, we try to tell good stories around here. Every Thursday morning, we do our community and charity series, all brought to you by our friends at Cole Roofing. You can learn more about that out on our website, and of course, email me anytime, anywhere, nasty@WNST.net. I talk about it on Facebook, and on Twitter, and on LinkedIn, and on Snapchat, and on Instagram, and all the places I see this next guy who has written a book, a local book with local concerns about football, which there aren't a whole lot of us who do this around here writing books. Jack Gilden has been my friend for about a quarter of a century, ever since he wrote an ad that I actually heard that I can actually put back on the air. It was for Crown Central Gasoline, one of my first corporate sponsors, and it had me somewhere on a rowboat on the back river, as I remember it, Jack Gilden. Good day to you, sir. How's life? And I know you got a new book out on Johnny U and Don Shula and the Colts, and I can't wait to take a look at it. I've already fingered through it. It's a little bit saucy, Jack, I got to admit, right?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it goes into a lot of the battles between those two men, and also some of the personal struggles of Unitas himself. So it does get a little saucy.
Well, first things first. You're a script writer. You've done all sorts of writing in the literary space. I see you out on Facebook and Twitter and LinkedIn and all those places that people around here. But you're a Baltimore guy, a Baltimore story. Why this book, and how did it come to you? And I guess this is something that's been burning on you for a long, long time. If in the 2000s you're still thinking about Johnny U and Shula, and a story that, quite frankly, maybe hasn't been told, because in that era, it was the tawdry facts were usually left out of the stories, right? It was a lot of Wheaties boxes and championing the cause, right?
Yeah, well, that's exactly right. I mean, I think it's the greatest football story that nobody ever really told, and it kind of came to me when I was about 15 years old, and a mutual hero of ours, John Stedman, had kind of remarked, to the side about the fact that Unitas and Shula had disliked each other. I was at a journalism conference put on by the Colts in one of their last years for high school students, and Stedman was a speaker there. And I remember thinking at that time, that's a really, really interesting story. The greatest coach, maybe who ever lived, and for sure the greatest player that ever played the game. They were together for 7 years, and they never won the title. And now here was Stedman saying that they, behind the scenes, they hated each other. I thought, that's a really interesting story. What happened there?
Well, I don't know that John wrote a lot about that, and I know John was close to both guys, certainly close to Johnny U, and I was close to John to the bitter end, and I miss him greatly. It's cool that you brought that story up, that I guess he came to a class of yours and affected your life, quite frankly, right? Like, all these years later, you're writing a book off of something he sort of offered in a class setting that maybe, and again, I've got a couple of Stedman books laying around here as well, that maybe he didn't write at length about that, or did he at one point?
Well, I mean, not to my knowledge. He himself spoke that day about how it was a story that the public did not know. And, and that's what really intrigued me about it. It's like everybody loves to write about the things that go right. I was listening to your great interview with the gentleman who wrote the book about the Eagles yesterday.
Oh, thank you.
And, and that's a great story to tell, but everybody wants to tell that story, especially in that moment. But, the story of great people who somehow don't quite pull it together, that's an interesting story to me. It's like about what makes people succeed, what makes them fail, that type of thing.
Or when you finish in second place like the Buffalo Bills. I mean, Marv Levy and Jim Kelly, they all still have great stories to tell, even though they never won the big one, which I think is part of this story, that both of these guys went on to legendary things but didn't do it together, right?
Didn't do it together, yeah. And that's really what separates them from Marv Levy and Jim Kelly. So if you look at Unitas and Shula separately, they won just as many titles as Bart Starr and Vince Lombardi did. They won 5 titles. Unitas won 3 with the Colts, and Shula won 2 with the Dolphins, including the undefeated season. But together, they couldn't do it, and that's what's so interesting to me. Unitas did it with 2 different coaches, And Shula was a wizard with quarterbacks. Besides Unitas, he had Greasy and he had Marino and Earl Morrill. But when he had his very best player and his very best teams, he couldn't win it, and neither could Unitas.
He is Jack Gilden. You can find him out on Twitter at Jack Gilden. He's local. The book is Collision of Wills, about the struggles of Don Shula, Johnny U. And, I love the old stories. I have been trying to sit down with Don Shula for about a decade because I had started to put together remnants of a leadership book that I was working on about 10 years ago. I still have all of the conversations of people connected to Baltimore sports. I did the last ever interview with Earl Weaver, and Earl sat with me for about an hour down in the lobby of the Harbor Court and just talking about leadership. And I haven't sat with Don Shula. Tell me where this is for you that, Johnny can't speak for himself at this point. Obviously, there are plenty of people around John's circle who would speak maybe on behalf of John or knew exactly what John was thinking. Plenty of those people exist in Baltimore. In the case of Shula, you can still sit and talk to him. I saw him at the Super Bowl last year. I have not made that hour to sit with him and his publicist, Fudge Brown, who's been my friend for 25 years as well, keeps saying, you got to come sit with Coach Shula. And I know I'm going to regret not doing it. I regret not sitting with Snellenberger at this point as well. But in your travels with Shula over the last 20, 30 years, how on the record is he about how he feels about it?
Well, it's very interesting. That's a great question. And it's very interesting because when I got back, I remember saying to my father, who's since passed away, and I was like, well, you could see why he was such a successful head coach for so many years because he really knew how to handle the press, and he kept you at arm's length somewhat. He seemed to earnestly address these difficult issues, but he kept you at arm's length.
Well, he was kind of an early CEO kind of, for the NFL. Him, Tom Landry,
sure
guys that wore suits that were X's and O's, but they weren't like grabbing their crotch and spitting. You know what I mean? They had moved on from that to become more, understanding the business, understanding leadership was more about more than just execution, that it was a mind game as well. And Shula played that game for Miami. I guess he learned a lot of lessons in Baltimore when he moved on, right?
Oh, he didn't only learn lessons in Baltimore. His career really crescendoed in Baltimore. He had a higher winning percentage than Lombardi did with the Packers. His winning percentage with the Colts was higher. His winning percentage with the Colts was higher than it was with Miami. I don't know that, our football fans in Baltimore today really understand the high level of football that we were playing here in the 60s. Weeb Ewbank was maybe the greatest coach who ever lived, but he didn't have great regular season percentage numbers, and Shula's numbers were just off the charts. He's winning like 75% of his games, and for about 5 years of his involvement with the Colts, they averaged about 2 losses per year for 5 straight years. It was an incredible string of success.
Well, and, I came onto the earth. My first game ever was the game that Marty Domrez had taken over, and Johnny U had gone to San Diego. And I always kid Stan White about this because Stan White separated Joe Namath's shoulder in the first football game I ever saw with my dad out on 33rd Street. And my dad bought me a San Diego Chargers pennant that hung on my wall, along with the Houston Oilers pennant because I love the Oilers, even the first day I ever saw a football game. I think I was attracted to, and I'm wearing, by the way, Jack, the Chicken Palooza shirt from our friends at Royal Farms, which is Oiler blue. So I've been having some fun with the red and the Oiler blue. It feels like I'm wearing Warren Moon here all week. But, the Chargers and the Colts and all of that was intertwined, I never saw that greatness. I only heard about that incredible pass to Hinton. And I saw that stuff, but I don't remember the Orange Bowl and the wagging finger. I remember the broken down Colts and then the pick me up Burt Jones Colts that came along, and the Sackpack Colts that were, a very, very big formative part. I mean, I was at the Fall game with Tony Linhart when I was 7 years old, so I remember all of that, and then the going away part. But all of this part of the 60s for me, whether it's Stedman stories or Tom Maddie telling me a story or any of those guys or Donovan, the people that I've interviewed in my 30 years of doing this, that it's all still a little mysterious to me and probably always will be, like the Beatles, you know what I mean? So anytime I see these stories and read these stories, it's, I go back to the 60s and I look at these records and I'm just going to read them out loud. 12-2, 10-3, 9-5, 11-1, 13-1, 8-5, 11-2, and nothing to show for it. And they hadn't won, so they were sort of maybe what the Bills were, what the Eagles were until they won. They were this major disappointment, right? That they were the engine that couldn't, right, in the end.
Well, I think that it's great that you understand it so well. I think that you're misinterpreting it a tiny bit, however. It's like you understand the numbers and you understand what happened, but I don't really think they were looked upon in the same way as the Bills were, or even in their own era, the Cowboys, who couldn't win it all, because the Colts had already won it all before Shula had gotten there twice, and were probably the best team in history in those late 50s.
Fair enough. I'm confusing eras to some degree. Right, exactly.
But I want to make a point here, though, which is that those Colts that you're talking about, like in the eras, like with the Shula era, and the records that you just, listed, yeah, I mean, they weren't seen that way like the Bills because of the presence of Unitas, because of the past of winning, but also because they were operating against Lombardi's Packers. So, you
and Tunney was getting field goals wrong and screwing us out of games, right?
Right. Well, that's exactly right. The Colts had terrible luck, bad calls, various things. And just also, too, Lombardi's Packers had really elevated the game to an extremely high level, but in an odd way. Instead of revolutionizing the game, he kind of took it back to its roots, and really perfected the art of blocking, the art of running the ball, the art of controlling the clock. And there's no doubt in my mind, after all the research that I did, that his Packers offense was a reaction to Unitas. He had seen enough of Unitas in the 58 championship game. He was the offensive coordinator of the Giants, and he knew what Unitas could do. And he knew his only hope for beating Unitas was to hold the football and keep it out of Johnny U's hands. So he had he kind of created an offense in Green Bay that was different than the one he had created in New York. It was more run-centric, and it was more fundamental, and I believe he did that to grind clocks and keep the ball out of Johnny U's hands.
Well, they also played horrific weather, as the Ice Bowl would also indicate. The Shula Unitas, the triangle with Baltimore and Miami and all that went into that, and Lombardi. The AFL also played a huge role in this, and the Colts' role with the Jets and where football was in that 66, 7, 8, 9, Namath, AFL. Things were moving, obviously, in the country as we look back on the summer of 68, which I did with Tim Wendell earlier this week. You check that out in the BuyAToyota.com audio vault as well. If we're talking about that era, race, riots, politics, all of that crazy stuff. On the football side, there was a real collision of a lot of things about to happen there. And, for me in Baltimore, we won 13 years apart or 12 years apart in the modern era. Super Bowls, it's crazy that it was 59 to 71, right? It was the same amount of time. But it didn't feel so unrequited around here over that decade from Billick to Harbaugh and Flacco as maybe it did back then, because those Colts teams were very dominant in a way that we didn't have that around here. That the disappointment was incredibly palpable after losing to the Jets, and the franchise hadn't won in over a decade, right?
Well, yeah. I mean, I think that was an incredibly traumatic moment. And, some of the other things that you're bringing up, some of the social issues, they're very big in that book, too. As football rose up, it became kind of a metaphor for America. And in a weird way, America became kind of a metaphor for football. I mean, 2 football coaches were nominated at the top of the presidential tickets in 1968. Not nominated, but considered for nomination. One was Bear Bryant on the Democratic side, and the other one was Vince Lombardi on the Republican side. Richard Nixon thought about asking him to be vice president. So football had a stature that was unimaginable to us today in the 1960s. And in my book, I kind of go, intertwine the social issues with the football issues. It's very interesting how they played on each other in that era.
Well, we would never want to mix sports and politics. We never do that in the modern era, right? We would never do that.
Well, that's what's so interesting is how it's all replaying itself and how athletics and especially football really did become a touchstone for the entire nation. But in the 60s, you had that event at the Mexico City Olympics, and you had, and which was really courageous of those athletes. I know a lot of us disagree about the stand that some of the football players are taking today, and I do understand that there's room for reasonable debate between those two sides, people who support them and people who do not support them. But, in 68, it was a very courageous stand to take. And
it still is if you're calling Kaepernick, by the way, or Kurt Flood for that matter, right?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's costing them their careers. I mean, it did Kurt Flood, and it certainly is Kurt Kaepernick, too. I mean, his most productive years are now being spent on the sidelines, and I'm sure that his stance is playing a part in that, and back in the late 60s, you also had Muhammad Ali avoiding service in the war, which, initially he was reviled by the majority of Americans, but eventually they came to respect him and the stance that he took.
Well, obviously, if you go to Atlanta and the Olympics and all of that. Jack Gilden here. The book is Collision of Wills. I've been waiting a long time to see the book. I know you've been working on it a long time as well.
Yeah, for years.
Give me peel back the onion, because anybody can go read the book right now. Give me the story behind the story about how the book came together and you getting this out and getting it printed and doing this circuit. I know you're going to be doing some book signings as well later on and telling these stories over and over again, because some of this stuff is sort of timeless, especially if you're a Baltimore sports fan, and I can't wait to dig into it myself. But, for putting it together and getting it there, look, I've written a couple of books. There's that crazy moment in the middle of the night where you think this is a good idea, and then you have to follow through, and you spend hundreds of days, as my wife says, being incredibly antisocial, like sort of Jack Torrance up at the Shining Mansion, trying to get it done. And trying to get it right. And I know how important it is to get a story like this right 50 years later. And I guess to my point, there's a lot of resources. You can research yourself to death, and at some point you got to put it out, right?
Well, that's exactly right, and especially the antisocial part. I mean, it's extraordinarily hard work, and it's extraordinarily lonely work, and it puts a lot of strain on your personal life because you are huddled by yourself all the time, and financially speaking, it's, there's not a lot of money up front in doing it, and you suffer.
It's a labor of love is what it is. I mean, really, it's like, this is what I'd rather be doing of any place else in the world tonight, writing Chapter 9 about the Ravens championship. I did all that, but I could only stay in that bubble for a while. I mean, Eisenberg goes 2.5 years into a book. I'm like, dude, books to me are a 3 to 6 month joint. Like, if I can't, that's why I gave the book up 10 years ago, because I couldn't get it. I couldn't bring it all together, and I still dream of bringing it together. But if I can't find the end of it, it's and I think sometimes that's hard to do when you start to research.
Well, as a writer, you have to fight through that, and you have to just, you have to outline out. But I have to say, I've never told you this before, but some of the work that you did really impressed me and really.
Thank you.
Really motivated me, and I'll give you a concrete example. It was the book that you wrote, the second book that you wrote about the Ravens, and the piece that you wrote about Joe Flacco's contract negotiations with the Ravens. And it was just such a great piece of old school reporting where you really had those sources and you really understood what happened, and you could take the reader behind the scenes in places that they couldn't possibly go, and probably very few other people knew about it and understood the subtleties of that negotiation. It was a gigantic negotiation.
It was only $100 million.
What's that?
It was only $100 million, right?
Yeah,
literally.
And it was just incredibly good reporting. It was incredibly good writing, and it really motivated me, in what I was doing, because I had never written a book before, and you were working on your second or third book or whatever it was, and it was so well done, and you and I had been friends since we were really young men, and leading parallel lives in a way, you in Dundalk and me in Owings Mills, and and it really motivated me how well you had done it.
Well, thank you. That's very kind of you. I said the same exact words to a friend of mine who wrote a book on the Ravens a number of years ago, and I think the same. John Feinstein. And when I read his book to motivate me to write my book. I read Stedman's book as well when I was writing my book. And I think that when it comes to writing prose and trying to put together a story that's 50 years old and have it told this way, where there really is conflict and you want to portray it fairly, because Johnny can't stand up for himself. So I'm sure you had the good angel on one side and the devil on the other side saying, I'm trying to tell this story fairly, but it's kind of an ugly story, because not all these stories are pretty, right?
No, they're certainly not, and it was very hard to do it. And what exacerbates it more is Johnny Yu was a real person, a family man. He lived here, almost all of his family lives here still. And to tell these stories that were, they were difficult stories to tell. And, some of them were very hurtful on a personal level. And it was, it was very hard to put it down on paper. But, I don't go into any journalism adventure with preconceived notions. Johnny Yu was a hero to me as a young man, that he endured so much rejection and then eventually persevered to become the very greatest player in the history of the game, which he undoubtedly is. And, to go into the project, I had to put that aside, and I had to say, I let the evidence come to me. I let the stories come to me, and I don't try and make the stories fit into a preconceived notion that I had in the beginning. So, for Johnny Yu, went into a lot of his personal life, which, was messy. He was a very good man in most respects, but he wasn't in the 60s at least. And I don't know that later on that he wasn't a very faithful husband, and he had hurt his first family greatly when he had moved on. And
I'm very aware of the animosity, right? I mean, that's sort of famous, right? Like, if you know anything about Johnny's legacy, children, that's pretty well documented to some degree that the families don't get along, and I think most people in the history of Baltimore sports know that. I've never felt like peeling back the onion. I've had a lot of people offer me that. Let me tell you that, and I'm like, for me, that part of it, I'm never interested in that. He said, she said, or picking a side in a divorce. You know what I mean?
Well, yeah, I do know, and I'm divorced myself, and I know, how hurtful it is, and how angry the two parties can become, especially when young children are involved.
Well, I'm the child of a divorce, so yeah, I got you, right? I learned that. That's the first life lesson you get, right? If your parents are divorced when you're 3 years old, right?
Yeah, then and I know it's a terrible thing, and you're fortunate. You have a great marriage, to a beautiful woman, and you're happy that way, and you avoided that fate that your parents had. But if you go through it, it's a catastrophe. And in his case, there was some interest in it on my part, in the sense that, Unitas seemed to be a famously unknowable man. Nobody really could understand who he really was. In that book by Callahan called Johnny Yu, he talks about how unknowable Unitas was on a personal level. And I was lucky that Johnny Yu's oldest child, Jan, his oldest daughter, she was a friend of mine, and she was, she's a really beautiful woman. She's a really articulate person, and, she's kind of like him. She's unsentimental, she's tough, she's unsparing, and she kind of gave me a window into the personal life there and the things that were happening at that period in time in the 60s. And it really uncovered, layers of the human being that had never really been uncovered to me before. And I'd read a lot about him. I'd read almost everything about him. So,
I've always thought the most fascinating part of him was his name, right? Unitas, right? You know what I mean?
That was a big part of the magic.
It kind of says it all, right?
Yeah, well, and that is true. I mean, he did have that ability. He was an uncanny leader, and nobody could quite figure out why. Because he didn't go to World War II. He didn't go to Korea. He was too young for those and too old for Vietnam, really. And but yet he had that kind of military leadership ability. But it wasn't really based on screaming at people or, like Bobby Lane would literally punch people in the huddle. And he wasn't like that. It was a personal magnetism and a belief that he could come through. They really believed in him, and that was the secret of his leadership.
He is Jack Gilden. The book is Collision of Wills. It's all about Don Shula and Johnny U and the rise of the modern NFL. You can find it anywhere books are sold. University of Nebraska Press, and you can find him at Jack Gilden on LinkedIn, on Twitter, all sorts of places as well. I guess as a parting shot on all of this, and the upshot of all of this is that having watched all of the mistakes that were made, right? Like the aftermath of all of this is Shula went to Miami, Unitas went to San Diego, Unitas left us 2 decades ago now going on, Shula is still here, Baltimore lost the franchise, with Irsay, Rosenblum, all the story that went on. Baltimore's football heritage and its legacy, even where we are going into this year with Lamar Jackson and Joe Flacco, whatever will be with John Harbaugh and Steve Bisciotti, whoever will own the team next and wherever it'll be, it really is a rich story, isn't it? And it's people like Unitas and Shula, and now, quite frankly, Ray Lewis is one of those characters. Ed Reed is one of those characters. Joe Flacco will be one of those characters. John Ogden, Brian Billick, my partner, John Harbaugh, anyone that touched one of these parades in any of these cities for all of our lifetimes, these stories get told. But the football story here is wacky, man.
It's
really
wacky. But it's all what makes it so weird is that it is crazy, and things are usually either crazy or great. And in the case of Baltimore, it was both crazy and great. And the Colts, literally will live on as probably the greatest football franchise. The Baltimore Colts were probably the greatest football franchise in the history of football, and the most important one too. The rivalries, the unbelievably great players. The Ravens are a great franchise, but they can't really hold a candle to what the Colts were in those years. When you just look at the unbelievable number of legendary players, going from one Hall of Fame coach to another Hall of Fame coach. Both could be considered the greatest coach who ever lived. It was just an incredible franchise. Baltimore has a huge place in the history and the building of that league that I don't know that modern people really, really get that.
Jack, how old are you?
53.
So your first Colt memory probably was Super Bowl V, maybe, kind of, sort of?
Yeah, or maybe even a little bit later. I'm almost identical to you. We're almost the same age. I'm a little bit older than you are. And, the Burt Jones years were also my real memories of the Colts as well.
Well, that's because you're a little older than me, right? So, you 75. I was 7, 8 years old, but I vividly, I went to all of those games. My dad took me I was at Ghost to the Post when I was 9 years old on Christmas Eve. So, that's how vivid it all is. And I guess a lifetime later, that's why a guy like you is writing a book like this and a guy like me is doing what I'm doing. And we're saying, because it made that kind of an impact on our lives.
Oh, it made a huge impact on our lives. And not only that, but it made a huge impact on our country. And that's what you'll get out of the book is not only did it make a huge impact on the history of football and on guys like us and all of our friends and our fathers and their friends, but it made a huge impact on the social history of the United States as well. It's a really important period of time and a really fascinating story that you've never heard before.
My man, I appreciate you getting up and talking about your book with us. It's Collision of Wills. Jack Gilden is our guest. You can find him out on Twitter. Talk to me about the book tour and where you're going to be. And I'm sure this will be on sale through the holidays and into the great beyond.
Oh, yeah.
This is a timeless story about Baltimore sports, really.
Yeah, it'll be, it's on sale right now on Amazon.com and on BarnesandNoble.com. It will be out in all the bookstores very soon, and as far as my speaking tours go, I'm going to be busy all fall long. I'm starting off at the Baltimore Book Festival, where John Eisenberg and I will be having a conversation for book fans there. And then I'm going to be all over Baltimore and all over the eastern United States, really, after that, all the way through Christmas.
Well, let me know when you and John Eisenberg are having a debate. I want to come and be a fly on the wall and have a Chardonnay and sit and watch that. So
I think it'll be on the second day of the book festival, that Saturday.
Hey, man, I turned 50 this fall, so, I'm wistful about all of it. So, as you know, John's one of my favorites as well, and I have him on all the time. It was great to share a chat with you. I hope we have a very, very relevant football season to offset the lack of relevance of the baseball franchise around here in the days and weeks to come. So,
I think we're going to have a great team this year.
Yeah, I think we need to have, a real season here that rolls late, where we get the purple lights out and do all that good stuff. We need a little shot of that here socially and civically. Jack, be well, take care, do good things with the book. I can't wait to finger through it and give it a further read.
Nestor, thanks for having me, and I just want to wish you well, and especially your wife.
Thank you very much. Jack Gilden.
Nice talking to you.
You got it. Collision of Wills is the book. You can find him out on Twitter as well. You can find that conversation as well as any of our conversations in the buyatoyota.com audio vault. That's there at WNST.net 24 hours a day from anywhere in the world. You can podcast, listen when you want, where you want, to what you want. Lots of stuff in there right now. Not just book authors and Raven stuff we got in there. I got some Oriole stuff in there. Got some good baseball conversations in there, as well as the aftermath of the Terps. We're trying to figure all that out. All in the buyatoyota.com audio vault. You can listen live from anywhere in the world by downloading the TuneIn radio app. That's also brought to you by our friends at buyatoyota.com. Our morning newspaper ships directly to your email inbox each and every morning. That's all brought to you by Planet Fitness and planetfitness.com, where it's still $10 a month to get in the best shape of your life. Guaranteed. Also brought to you by the Maryland Jockey Club. They're racing at Laurel. Got the Maryland Million coming up on October the 20th. Make sure you're paying attention to that. The entries are on the front of WNST.net every day, as well as in our morning newspaper. Big thanks to the friends at the Maryland Jockey Club for the sponsorship. Make sure you get down to Laurel, too, man. The new sports book they got there, it's fantastic. It's nice. Vegas style. Big time. I like it. Nasty at WNST.net reaches me. I'm on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, Snapchat, Instagram, streaming live right here on our Facebook Live, as well as our YouTube WNSTV channel, where I'm drinking from my Pizza John's cup. Get down to Pizza John's, get me a cheesesteak sometime soon, get some pizza pie as well. They've been down there 50 years, doing it better than anybody on Back River Neck Road. Pizza John's, one of our enduring sponsors around here. You'll see me eating a pie out on social media sometime soon. Nasty at WNST.net is your best bet to find me, your best bet to find the breaking news is to be on the WNST Tech Service. That's all brought to you by Coons Ford of Security Boulevard. Dennis Kolatzis will be here on Thursday, driving you home from 3 until 5. It is the SSV on WNST. We are WNST.net, AM 1570, and WNST Towson, Baltimore, and we never stop talking Baltimore sports.